Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Don Presnell here, Director of the Common Reading Program. Thank you so much for taking time out of your late afternoon to join us here on the fifth day of spring. We are so excited, but Elizabeth and I have been talking. It's kind of bittersweet. This is our fourth and final visit, but boy, we've had a lot of fun and we've learned a lot too. So what I'm going to do in just a moment, I'm going to introduce people and I'm going to step back to the side. And if you're watching out there, we will be running a chat. So if you've got a burning question that you'd like answered, I will do my dead level best to kind of politely interrupt our panelists and Elizabeth as we move through. I did want to remind everybody one last time that this I have dedicated this year as a common reading program to two gentlemen who are near and dear to me that we lost last year. Dr. Emery Maiden, who was a previous director of Common Reading Program a few years ago, and Dr. Wayne Matthews. So if you can go to commonreading.appstate.edu, click on news and just read that little kind of memory / write-up I did for them. And just so you can kind of get an idea what those fellows were like, I'd appreciate it. And Elizabeth, you know you've got a quiz coming up here, right?
Yes, I do. And I want to say, Don, I have gone to that page and read your write-up of those men, and they sound wonderful. So it's an honor to be part of this.
Thank you.
Dedicated.
That means a lot. Thank you so much. All right. So surprise. Now we've covered culture. We've covered linguistics of a sort, I guess you would say, and whatnot. So we're going to go geography this time. So okay. in the spirit of our general education program, we want all of our students to know a lot about several different areas. So I'm feeling pretty confident in you, Elizabeth. So here you go. So I went onto Google Maps, and I know you've taken the I will not look it up on Google and make it look like I'm not pledge. I know you've done that, so you're not going to Google this, even though I have.
Right.
So here's your quiz. So I went and just kind of did a look-see on a website at the 81st degree west longitude line, just straight old vertical line there. That runs right through us. That runs right through us here in Boone, North Carolina. It also runs through Daytona Beach, Florida. It also runs through Columbia, South Carolina. And this is the one that's going to mess with you, or at least it did for me. It also runs straight down through Salinas, Ecuador. Okay, so here's my question for you, and I am trying to trick you a little, but in the spirit of learning. So, Elizabeth, and you're an expert, right, on sea level and stuff. So my question: what do you think, Elizabeth? Out of those four, is the lowest sea level? Daytona Beach, Boone, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Salinas, Ecuador.
Oh, man. You know what? I think I might. I mean, I'm going to admit that I don't know. I'm just going to say that.
It's a little hard. It's a little hard. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I had to make it just a smidge challenging. So
I'm kind of torn between Columbia, South Carolina. I don't really know where Columbia, South Carolina is.
Well, I'm going to help you a little bit. It's right in the middle of South Carolina. So.
Okay, so it's not Columbia. Salinas, Ecuador.
Are you sure?
Or Daytona Beach, or you're totally messing with me. But I thought maybe there was a trick in there somewhere.
There was, but with a modicum of help from me, I think you got it. What was your last response?
Daytona Beach.
Daytona Beach is correct. You just want to take a real quick stab at the number because it's pretty low. It's pretty low.
Going with zero.
13.
Okay.
And we here in the mountains are.
Don, I should have known. The walk went to my head. Beach is in the name, but some part of me was like, maybe Daytona Beach is like, I don't know.
Too easy.
Like a car race, too easy. So, I got stumped.
So it's 13
in a bad way.
No, like, you didn't.
I have to own that.
This is what I'm talking about. This is our last event. I'm so going to miss this, but it's 13 feet. Salinas, Ecuador is 41. Columbia, South Carolina is 292. And we here at App State, and this is nice and easy to remember, 3,333.
Yeah, no, I knew it wasn't you. I knew it wasn't you.
So thank you for playing, Elizabeth. We're gonna give you full credit on that one. So thanks much. So everybody, thank you.
Be a way of showing everyone that you can't know it all.
Oh, I love it. Okay. All right, folks. Thanks for indulging me there. I love it. All right. So today we have with us the following folks. We have Ashley Shreves from Charlotte, North Carolina. She's studying recreation management with a concentration in parks and recreation and minors in Spanish and sustainable development. We have Omia Mitchell from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She's a senior majoring in sustainable development with a concentration in environmental studies and a minor in sustainable business. So Omia is about as sustainable as you can get. So we're glad she's with us today. Sarah Umflett is from Mooresville, North Carolina, a junior majoring in public relations and minoring in sustainable development. And our viewers from our first two events this year will remember Laura England, senior lecturer in Department of Sustainable Development and founder. That's right, folks. We know how to find them. Founder of the Climate Stories Collaborative at Appalachian. And also, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Anne, even though she's going to talk to us in just a moment, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce everyone at the same time. Anne Eringhouse from Ocracoke Island. So we're really going to make this resonate today with our state and the community, the idea and the idea of community. So Anne moved to Ocracoke Island, which is part of North Carolina's Outer Banks, back in 1971 when she was age 22. So not that long ago, to teach. It's like that, Ann. To teach in the one-room schoolhouse. Don. You're welcome. The island population was 550. She's the author of two books about the island, Ocracoke Portrait, Photographs and Quotes, published in 1988, and 10,000 Breakfasts, about 30 years in the bed and breakfast business she started on the island. In 2020, she published a book of poetry, much of which is inspired by her life near the ocean. She's exhibited her photography all over the Southeast. Her pictures made on Ocracoke after Hurricane Dorian in 2019 were chosen for the Photoville Fence, the largest outdoor photography show in the world, and featured photo essays by 85 photographers across the United States. She has watched sea level rising for 50 years on this small 15-mile long island. And today, Ocracoke has about 900 residents. So we'll jump into that. But first, Elizabeth has graciously agreed to start us off with a very short and apropos reading from Rising. So Elizabeth.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's conversation. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I thought that I would read a short passage that comes at the very end of the book and is actually only in the afterword of the paperback edition. And in it, I'm going back to visit a community that I had spent years researching and writing about on Staten Island, and I used to teach at the College of Staten Island. I met my husband on Staten Island. He lived on Staten Island when we first met, so Staten Island's a big part of our lives. And this is about going back to Staten Island, and in particular Oakwood Beach, after I had moved away and after many of the residents in this community chose to move away as part of a state-run buyout. I still return to Oakwood Beach sometimes. Most of the homes are gone by now. The land where they once stood repopulated with fennel and wild parsnip and Queen Anne's lace. Deer graze on the native grasses and other wild plants the city seeded. Canadian geese waddle down the roads where kids used to play basketball. I always walk along the disintegrating berm and down what was once Fox Beach Avenue. I walk past the place where Nicole Montalto's house stood. She's a woman whose testimony is in the book earlier, who lost her father during the storm. Past Joe Chirone's lot and Pedro Correras. On my most recent visit, I noticed Frank Acosta's home had finally been demolished too. It's So I emailed her to ask for an address where I might send a copy of this book. Frank, I learned, had moved to Florida. I feel safe in my new home, she wrote. When severe weather strikes, I'm no longer nervous. The river is close by, but not very close and way downhill from here. Choosing to leave took Franca longer than it did most others. It was a decision she had to reach on her own. The journey towards her departure unique. However, moving away from risk would have been impossible without the financial assistance of the buyout program. She told me she got just enough money to relocate to Daytona Beach, where much of her family.
Not good.
I look back and am surprised it took me so long to leave. Now I no longer want to live by the water. Funny how we change over time. On my most recent trip to New York City, Joe invited me to lunch with Frank Mazinski and John Toto, the two other leaders of Staten Island's successful buyout movements. We ate fish sandwiches at the family restaurant John owns and chatted about what had changed in the 5 years since the buyouts began, and also what hadn't. I didn't move far, Frank said, just up the hill and out of the floodplain. Me neither. I still have this place here, John added, touching the wooden tabletop. They were all living close to the homes they'd lost to the storm. They still went to the same butchers and grocery stores and hung out with the same people on the weekends. Joe was still a local real estate broker, and Frank still worked construction with the city's recovery program. Sometimes they went down to the pier near Oakwood to fish. Their community network remained largely intact. What had changed was their immediate vulnerability to flooding. I asked how many people from the buyouts remained on Staten Island, and Joe said, without missing a beat, about 80%. At first, I figure his number was exaggerated, that more residents had been like Franca and moved far away to Florida, upstate, or elsewhere. But later that month, during a preparatory conversation for a panel at the National Adaptation Forum, one of my fellow proposed presenters shared her findings that 79% of participants in the Staten Island buyouts had indeed remained within a 5-mile radius of their former homes. Many of them had moved to areas with lower income thresholds, but all were able to maintain the bonds they had built over decades with their fellow Oakwood residents. When we talk about buyouts, we tend to focus on the losses they perpetuate, the loss of community, the loss of property taxes, the loss of a home place. But like so much else in climate discourse, this is a discussion that plays out far from the water's edge, and it frames those impacted by higher tides and stronger storms solely as victims. When I listen to the stories rising from Staten Island's eastern shore, I hear a counter narrative, one of transformation and of hope. Oakwood's former residents wanted to leave a legacy, to be part of something larger than themselves, and to aid adjacent neighborhoods in the process. By joining forces and moving away from risk, these people became agents of change, not just flood victims or refugees. The buyout, surprisingly, brought them closer together.
Beautiful. Thank you. Transformation and hope. That's awesome. Okay, Laura, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that reading, Elizabeth. And I think it's increasingly important that we highlight the stories of climate agency as we talk about climate change. I'll say it's just such a joy to be able to join you again and speak with you. And thanks again, Don, for inviting me and my students to be a part of this. Elizabeth, we're just so grateful for your work, which is just going to continue to grow in importance as the problems of climate change and our understanding of them continue to grow. Just today, I came across a new study published yesterday about sea level rise along the U.S. Atlantic coast, documenting that the rate of sea level rise in the 20th century was the fastest of the last 2,000 years and was twice the average sea level rise from the years 0 to 1800. And so we have to work together to keep elevating the profile of climate change in public discourse. And your writing really helps us to do that in so many ways. Before we begin with some questions for you, I want to note that the student co-hosts, Omia, Ashley, and Sarah, are part of a class called Outreach Skills for Sustainability. And our entire class contributed to thinking about what kinds of questions that we would like to ask you today. So I want to recognize their contributions. We'll start by asking you some questions that relate to climate change impacts, and then later we'll have questions for you about communicating about climate change, since you're such a remarkable climate storyteller. So I'll start us off with a question focused on the intersections of colonial legacies and climate disruptions. And you write about this in different places in your book. One of the key landscape impacts of colonialism around the world was to separate land from water, especially in the ways that coastal wetlands were smothered with dredge and fill materials in order to build up higher ground that we could then build urban development on top of. And so today, now hundreds of millions of people around the world in coastal communities, including the communities that you wrote about, are now in harm's way because of that colonial legacy. Can you talk about your thoughts on our need to come to terms with this and other legacies of colonialism as we face and respond to the climate crisis?
For sure. As you were speaking about this, framing sort of our present day vulnerability and the development that we've had of this low-lying land, the wetlands that line our shores, as being part of the legacy of colonialism, you're absolutely right. And something that flashes in my mind is a really fabulous map that is in, I'm going to forget the name of the book, but it shows the San Francisco Bay area, and there are over 50 different tribes that inhabit the area that we think of as San Francisco Bay. 50 different sort of indigenous groups with different linguistic markers amongst them. And one of the things that anthropologists have said is there are these different sort of distinct areas where these groups lived, but there was also this relating to that they call them, tidelands, the wetlands of the San Francisco Bay, as more of a shared resource, that it was a space that was abundant enough in the fruits of the sea that it could offer that it didn't have to be sort of sectioned off or belong to anyone. And there was a sense of shared ownership of this really dynamic space. And it's a space that's kind of neither land nor water, as you point out. And that in-betweenness is part of its abundance. And I think, as I get deeper into the question of what the climate crisis can awaken in us, there's part of me that really hopes that we can move back towards a space of relating to our tidelands as common lands, as something that is a space that is abundant and can be shared amongst everyone. I was talking with a friend and someone who's, an expert in climate change policy. And one of the things they proposed was, what if we started to think about a national seashore? We have the national park system. What if we started thinking about creating, a giant park that would wrap our entire nation's coastline? And what if we had this 90,000-mile long park that we all got to have shared ownership over? And I think there's something in the climate change narrative that we always focus on loss, but there's something it's also equally important to have sort of a vision of the future and what you can work towards as part of your response to climate change. So in some ways, I definitely pair that vision of a potential future to work towards with thinking about healing the scars of colonialism on the land and our relationship to it. I think those two things actually can very much go hand in hand. But there's also then this muddy, difficult question of, well, what do you do with all the people who live in those spaces now that relate to them as their own? And, the other thing I've learned from following the stories of people in flooding communities is that the decision can't be forced on you to leave. It has to be one that you arrive at on your own terms. But there's certainly policies that we can put in place to make those choices more easily achieved and less lost in the long road that you must take to get there. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to pass the baton to our student co-host, Omia.
Hi. Wonderful to be here today. I do have a question. So in our introductory course in my department, is called Principles of Sustainable Development. We discuss how climate change and other environmental degradation practices displaces millions of people, not only in a literal way, but it also erodes people's sense of place and what they see as home and how they connect to the place that they call home. So it eventually becomes like home becomes this unrecognizable place that they don't really know how to connect to. And they even start seeing their home as a danger and not somewhere that they seek safety in. So your book documents people and communities feeling disconnected from their homes in coastal regions because of rapid environmental change, which you just mentioned. Could you share a few examples of you seeing this with our audience, especially for the people who may have not read your book? Thank you.
Absolutely. In my mind, one thing that actually immediately pops to mind is something that John Bear Mitchell said to me when I was interviewing him. He's a member of the Penobscot Nation and Penobscot historian in coastal Maine. And he actually, you know what? He didn't say this to me. One of my students was interviewing him and he said it to her and she included it in one of her final projects. And I asked if I could use it as the epilogue, what's the thing that comes at the beginning of the book? The epigraph for the book? I think that's right. He said to her, you know, the Penobscot people have suffered incredible loss over centuries. It's not just the climate crisis, which has fundamentally changed our relationship to the places where we make our lives. And then he said to her, you know, take, for instance, the caribou. The caribou, the word, the symbol, our paintings of this animal are still alive in our ceremonies, even though the last one died years ago because of colonialism. And so there's, you know, I see in this desire to continue to relate to this animal that is of spiritual importance to this group of Indigenous people and to keep the memory of that animal alive. Even though it's not on this earth anymore, I see in that gesture a fundamental, you know, redefinition of what home is or what we might think of as home. And, you know, I think you're absolutely right. And it also makes me wonder if there's this grief and this mourning, but also this deep sense of holding on to the things that we think define us sort of against all odds. If we might start to think of that act as an act of relating to home, you know, I think that we're in a time of incredible transformation, and even our definition of what a home place is under transformation. And I think there's an incredible, I'm so reticent to use the word resilience because I think that sometimes we ask certain underserved communities to be resilient when we don't ask other communities to be resilient. But there's something in that gesture of keeping the spirit of that thing alive, even when it's not here anymore, that I don't want to say it's resilience. I don't want to say it's hope, but there's something to be learned from that gesture. And I think it's a very human gesture. I think that we do that when we lose a loved one. We do that in lots of other ways. And I wonder if we can start to think about, maybe treating home places like we do, or the idea of home, what home is, the way we treat someone, be they present in our lives or passed through it, and no longer present. I think, there's wisdom there that can help us navigate the changes that are being demanded of us.
Awesome. That was a great response. I have a question for you, and it's a little bit switching gears, but I was wondering, what parallels have you noticed between the pandemic and climate change in terms of how people are accessing and engaging with information, and how these people are responding to the pandemic and climate change?
Well, I think I noticed a couple pretty strong parallels between the pandemic and climate change. I think that we see, fundamentally, I just want to say we see that our most vulnerable human communities, the communities that are most vulnerable going into these moments of crisis, those vulnerabilities are exacerbated during the crisis, and they're definitely living on the front lines of these crises in ways that others aren't. And so I want to, notice and note that fundamental inequality at the heart of both of these crises that really, in some ways, I think just scrapes away whatever illusions we might have about how fundamentally, structurally unequal our society is. In terms of access to information and the way we're accessing information, I think there is also some of the deep kinds of skepticism towards the science of climate change is similar to some of the deep skepticism that's been displayed to the science of the pandemic. And I think that that's partly because of how isolated we can be in our homes, in front of our computer screens, only logging into or hearing voices that might reflect back at us, our already predisposed biases and I count myself among those. I have to remind myself, at some point I had to remind myself, you have to sign up to be a follower of Donald J. Trump's Twitter profile. Like, you can't just pretend like this other worldview doesn't exist. Though when we're cloistered in our homes and asked not to be part of physical community interactions, it's a lot easier to just kind of get stuck in the same feedback loops that tell you whatever story that you're comfortable hearing. So I see sort of the way we access information around these crises and the worldviews that they can reinforce, sort of, and our entrenchedness in that grows. I think that we are taught to relate to the pandemic and climate change in much the same ways because of that. And that makes me pretty nervous. I think there was, 10, 15 years ago, this idea that the internet was going to democratize information, and we were going to have these really radically egalitarian conversations in these digital spaces. And boy, are we really far away from whatever utopic vision that was batted around, 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that answer. That was very I'm trying to think of the word. It was very on point for kind of summing up how we're all relating to each other in this kind of era. I have a question kind of related to that in regards to how we consume and kind of process information. One of the issues that climate communicators face is this, I think, psychological numbing that we go through, where when large numbers of people are experiencing disasters or the impacts of rapid global climate change, things like that, our response to our emotional response to it can be diminished the larger the numbers get. And I think we've seen this with the pandemic. Like people don't respond any greater to 500,000 deaths to 400,000 deaths.
Right.
And we've seen it with hurricanes and the catastrophe in Texas and war zones across the world. So it's all like a different storm, but the same response. So I guess my question for you is, how have you observed this throughout your work, and how can we address it in our climate conversations?
You're absolutely true. I mean, it happens to me just as much as it happens to the next person, that there is, I think, just generally speaking, at least for me, statistics can be kind of numbing. Like there isn't any real noticeable difference between 500,000 and 400,000 deaths. In my mind, those are just numbers. I don't have any tactile details to make those individuals come to life for me when I hear those numbers. And I think in many ways, that's the kind of reporting that I had to do when I started covering climate change. It's like, okay, if you're going to get climate change in the news, it has to be a record-breaking storm. You have to have, and then you kind of just fill in the blanks. Record-breaking storm kills blank number of people and destroys X number of billions of dollars of coastal property. And I started to get really bored writing those stories. And I felt like they fundamentally did not map onto the stories that I was hearing from people living in those communities, that there is this real radical difference between talking about climate change in this abstract kind of language and talking about what it feels like to live in one of these communities that is underwater again and again. To the point, so, as a climate change communicator, I think that's really why I chose to write to include the testimonies in Rising, because I wanted to bring readers into that experience of sitting in someone's living room and listening to them talk about what the storm took away from them and what it woke up in them in terms of their vulnerability and what they could do about it. Just last week, I think I was teaching a workshop to frontline flood survivors on how to write op-eds to their local newspapers. And the thing that we focused on was, that lead paragraph and what are the kinds of details that they should put in it to grab the reader's attention. And, we talked about saying, there's a difference between, Hurricane Harvey took my house, and Hurricane Harvey, I watched the floodwaters rise on August 30th, rise up above the wheels of the 1989 Honda Accord that my son had saved 5 years working at the local KFC to buy, right? Like there was, in those details, you suddenly have a picture of who that person is and what the storm took away from them. This is not just a car. This is a car that they can't necessarily afford to replace. This is a car that was labored after and scraped after and saved for. And so we're not just talking about losing a car. We're talking about losing the 5 years you spent saving for that car. We're talking about the fact that, their son can maybe now get to work and not ride the bus. We're talking about a lot of different things. And you don't need to say like, we don't have the money to replace the car. You just paint a picture of that person's circumstances and who they are through some of those details. And so I think when we traffic in all these statistics, we lose sight of that. And one of our things as climate communicators, one of our challenges is to, carry whomever we're hoping to reach again and again into the shoes of those people who are living on the front lines of these questions, the people for whom the difference between 2 degrees of warming and 2.1 degrees of warming is not something abstract, and it's not like, oh, the air is like a tiny bit warmer today. No, these are real distinctions that have real impacts on real people's lives. And so I think trafficking in those messy details, those intimate details, is one of the ways that we can keep people awake to climate change's real impact.
That's great. Thank you all. Wow. So we've already had a full round of questions from some very intelligent folks. This is awesome. Anne, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and segue to you. Just go ahead and say hi to everybody so we can let them see you. And then I'll pull up some pictures for you, and you just tell me when you want those on the screen. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Appreciate everybody's interest in this topic, and especially I want to say how important it is what Elizabeth just finished saying, that when this moves from the abstract to the personal, to the emotional lives of real people, then we have a different story. We have a story, period. We don't have data and theories. We have real life. And so I want to say a little bit about Ocracoke Island, which is part of North Carolina's Outer Banks. It's south of Cape Hatteras. It's a small 15-mile island, and 14 miles of it is a national seashore. So we do in North Carolina already have a lot of land designated as national seashore. It's called Cape Hatteras National Seashore. And some of it's on Ocracoke and some of it is on Hatteras Island. And then south of Ocracoke, we have Portsmouth Island, and that's Cape Lookout National Seashore. And that goes for 56 miles. So, you know, we have that already happening, but there's a lot that can happen in a 1 mile little village, and that's what Ocracoke has, just a 1 mile village. I moved there when I was 22, and the population was 550 people. People were living on rainwater, which was no problem. We just had to find out how to do it. And we had a little 1-room schoolhouse that had just been built, and I went there to be a teacher. We had our first teachers meeting, and they said our school budget for the year will be $37. And this was 1971, but $37 wasn't enough in 1971 either. So that became a very creative job, trying to get around lack of supplies, lack of money. The kids rode their bikes to school. Most people were barefoot. I did wear shoes as a teacher. But it was, I could never, ever say how much I have learned in 50 years of living on that little 15-mile island. It's located 23 miles off the coast of North Carolina, and we have 3 ferries that approach, one from the south, one from the west, and one from the north. And, you know, they run when they can. Right now, I can't get home because the ferries haven't run for a few days. We're having a northeaster, and they've stopped running. So, a big thing I want to say is how much I learned about impermanence living there, and how much I stopped having expectations that everything would happen the way we wanted it to, or somebody said it would. The weather really rules everything. And when the weather rules, that affects the ferries, that affects who's coming or who's going. One guy missed his vacation on a cruise ship because he couldn't get on the ferry to get to the town where the cruise ship departed. We have a million stories of things we have missed. And after a while, I realized, okay, I'm changing. I'm just accepting that. Maybe I'll get there and maybe I won't. And it took a lot of pressure off always expecting everything to work. I don't expect everything to work. And I see how much difficulty that makes for visitors to the island because they want everything to work. They haven't lived there for 30 years or 10 years or 10 weeks. They would learn it fast. You can learn it in about 2 weeks, but they haven't done that. So they're constantly disappointed or mad or something. And I think coastal people, one reason coastal people are so flexible, I'm not going to say resilient, I'm going to say flexible, is because we've all dealt with this. And it has shaped us. It's made us who we are. When I moved to the island, we didn't have a hardware store. I always had a clipboard that I kept a list of here's what I need the next time I go ashore and get to a hardware store. Or if anybody's coming to visit, I could say, hey, could you pick up this or that? Because we didn't have it. But by the same token, I didn't really need it that much. Or maybe I did, but I could do without it for 2 weeks until somebody came or till I went off the island. So I see all these, what a lot of people would call difficulties, I see them as life shapers. And they have helped me be happy with less, but the natural beauty is the main thing we have. So I never feel deprived because that is always just so, sorry, I'm shaking my table. That's always making up for everything. I mean, that is everything. That's why I moved there. The natural beauty was just so incredible. And here I am 50 years later, and almost all the time I'm thinking, wow, that is incredible. Look at that. And that just fills me up in some kind of way that I can't really describe other than to say it's deeply nourishing and spiritual. So we were first settled by the Algonquin Indians, then came pirates, and along with pirates came pilots. And North Carolina had a big freight industry in the 1700s. And the people couldn't navigate the shoals because we've always had a lot of storms and hurricanes, and it moves the sand around a lot. So the very first settlers to Ocracoke, it was first named Pilot Town. These people were seagoing pilots who would go out and meet the freight boats and help them navigate through the shoals so they could bring in their cargo. So it wasn't until much later, I moved there in 71, and tourism was barely on the radar. It was really a fishing village. Of the 550 people who were there, there were mostly like 13 to 15 families. We had a tiny little phone book that had 3 pages to it. And luckily in the school then, everybody was related. I got to know all the extended families, and it was just so different from how I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. But what I really loved about it was how connected everything was. And everybody knew each other and everybody helped. The average income at that time was $4,400. Now there's some people who make more than that in a weekend due to tourism. So we've undergone a tremendous amount of change, tremendous amount. So over the years in the 90s, I moved into some political awareness of what was happening as more and more people were seeing the beauty of our town and wanting some of it and dreaming up developments that we'd been doing fine without ever having. And so I worked on the land use planning committee and began to learn about the importance of the wetlands and how development really limits the effectiveness of wetlands for stormwater runoff. The other thing that began happening a lot was people were filling in their land. They were filling it with sand or topsoil or gravel on their driveways. And all of this began to raise the family homes just a little bit higher in that search for a little security. But then the roads became the lowest place in town. And that is still the case. And I don't know how we're ever going to solve that, because now if it rains for 3 hours, the roads are flooded. And that's a big problem. And when we have hurricanes, sometimes the ocean water comes up over the island, mostly in the National Seashore, and goes under the pavement and breaks it up into big chunks. I've really watched the water table change significantly. When I first moved there, the official elevation was 2 feet. That's what the state of North Carolina stated, suggested 2 feet. And now I wouldn't want to guess what it is. We've had an invasion of Phragmites, which is a wetland invasive plant. We never used to have it. I never remember seeing it. And only in the last 5 years do I really see it all over the wetlands. And it again is going to slow down the stormwater runoff if we have hurricanes or flooding. It's a problem. And I know it's a problem in Cape Cod because I've traveled there some to do photography, and they've tried to burn it out. They're trying to think of different ways to get it out. We've actually had a lot of action in our town against offshore drilling, because we all can see that would take away everything we have. Fishing, tourism, the beauty, everything. And this is an issue that actually brought our fisher people, mostly men, but a few women, and everybody. This is like a big thing we really agreed on. And we did a lot of protesting when there was a movement with Mobil Oil to drill on the Outer Banks. And we ended up getting some state policies changed, and offshore drilling didn't happen. And then it creeps back like every 5 to 7 years, somebody's talking about it again. And it's just been, I think President Biden has just discontinued any talk about it again. So we have recurring issues, which I'm sure everybody does. We still have no septic system. We operate on no sewage system. We operate on septic tanks. So when we have hurricanes, septic is moving around in floodwaters, which is a hazard, public health hazard. I want to go to Hurricane Dorian. We've always had hurricanes. When I moved there in 1971, the first week I was living there with my then husband, we had a hurricane, and we were getting ready to start a job, and we couldn't go to work for 3 weeks. And we hadn't thought yet about how you have to work a month before you get a paycheck. And we had 3 weeks. And then we were going to work a month and get a paycheck. So that was a really hard time. But we're still having hurricanes. I have no idea how many I've been through. So many. And sometimes I leave and sometimes I stay. But on September 6, 2019, Don, you want to put up the first picture?
Sure. And I'm just going to leave this, pardon the techno look here, but if these dual monitors mess things up here, so I'm just going to leave it on the, just a second. There we go. And by the way, there's Ann's books that she mentioned. And there you go, Ann.
Okay. So that first book, well, I call it My Love Poem to Ocracoke. It's really about the precious community that I found here when I came to live and was so welcomed by. And then the book on the right is called 10,000 Breakfasts. And then I began creating community in my own home. I bought a home built by the second to last lighthouse keeper on the island. And I turned it into a bed and breakfast and met so many great people from all over the world. So that book is about that experience of community. Okay, let's move on. In Hurricane Dorian, can everybody see that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. We had 7 feet of water come over the island in 2 hours. And people have compared the sound of it to, a train, a lot of really loud vehicles, motor vehicles. It was pushing tremendous force over the island. We had 600 houses that were flooded, and that's probably about half to a third of all that we have. And we had 400 cars that were flooded. I've lost 3 cars now in hurricanes. I was actually glad to lose this last car. I was thinking I need a new beach car, but this is not the best way to get it. The best way to get it is go to the bank and get a loan. But anyway, I mean, for days they were hauling cars off the island. 400 cars were ruined. And a lot of the newer cars now have their brain under the driver's seat. So when the car floods, the seawater is going under the driver's seat a lot. And then the car it can just spontaneously catch on fire, which we had after Hurricane Matthew. Several cars, just the people were upstairs in their house and their car caught on fire. And then in one case caught their house on fire. So sometimes, even though the car will still drive, you don't want to drive it. So we're in this interim period now after Dorian where everybody's driving a different car and we don't all know each other's cars yet. So there's a little bit of privacy for a little while, a few months, until we learn, oh, that's your new car. Okay, that's your beach car. Okay. So that is a tremendous amount of loss for a tiny town. We have had 50 historic houses torn down, condemned by the county and torn down. And that is never coming back. I mean, those historic homes, they're never coming back. And that's what got me started about making pictures of after Dorian. So this picture you're looking at was a family home place, 3 or 4 generations, and that's all that's left, the little sidewalk leading up to it. Okay, next, please, Don. So this is an old hotel on the island. And to me, all these pictures, I mean, I kind of edited them. They're all straight shots, but I edited them to look more old-timey because it felt like the hurricane just threw us back in time. And, I don't know if we're trying to get to 2021. I don't really care if we get to 2021. I don't think a lot of people care, but we do want to rebuild our feeling of community. And, I really appreciated, again, in Elizabeth's book, when she talked about how much people have to come to their own decisions about what they're going to do. No one else knows how hard you worked for your home, your life in a coastal area. And, people say this about hurricanes. I don't know why people won't leave. Well, they won't leave because this is their home. And if they leave and then the ferries don't run, they can't return. And then they're staying in a motel and they're just spending money they don't want to spend and sometimes don't have to spend. So it's way more complicated than just why aren't other people doing what I think they should do. It's way more complicated than that. And I just want to say that, and I really, really honor how much you included that in the book. I think it makes the whole book better. All of the stories and the, how people are coping. Okay, next on the picture. So this picture I really want to describe to you. It started as a World War II barracks. Until Hurricane Dorian, the biggest change that ever came to Ocracoke Island was World War II. And we had a Navy base that was built there. We had 1,500 men, mostly men, stationed there. We had subs there. They dredged the harbor so submarines could get in and out of the harbor. The harbor is very small, but that's how we got the biggest hill on the island. When they dredged the harbor, they put all the sand in one place and it looks like a one good hill, but it's totally man-made. So what once was here was a long barracks building. After the war, the building was moved over behind our schoolhouse, and it became a recreation building. And then maybe 20 years later, it moved out onto the main highway and became a great restaurant. So in Dorian, it was totally flooded and condemned. And the day that I made this picture and it was coming down, there probably were 60 people standing in the road watching it. And one person said, I went to Girl Scouts in that building. And I said, I was a teacher in that building. And somebody else said, I was a waitress in that building. I'm not sure there's another building on the island that so many people had a relationship with. And we watched that relationship going away. Now, whoever moves to the island now, they never saw it in any of those forms. I don't know how we tell them how important that building was, how much it met the needs of our community over and over and over again. And this brings me to this word that I'm not sure whether it was in the book or whether I heard it in one of the other talks about this rising book. It's called solastalgia. Did you talk about that, Elizabeth?
No, and it's not in the book, but it's a great word.
Well, I've never heard it before, but I totally understand it. And it's about when home doesn't look or feel like home anymore. And it's really a psychological state. And it's really difficult to navigate. Being a photographer at Ocracoke for so long, I'm used to looking at all the details. I mean, I drive by and think, oh, they moved their trash can to the other end of their fence, or oh, they cut 2 limbs off, or oh, they moved that swing set. I'm just seeing all of that, and also seeing the natural beauty. Like, that's the best pomegranate tree on the island, and there's the biggest fig tree. And when I turn this corner, I'm going to see that incredible oleander that is so beautiful. And some of those things are now gone. And if you arrived on the island today, you would never know they were there. So there's no sense of loss there. But there is for so many of us who are so used to those things being important parts of our life. So I just want to say that, and say that word again, solastalgia. I like that it's kind of a combination of nostalgia and maybe solace. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a powerful, powerful theory or concept, but also is a reality that I totally have am experiencing. Okay, 2 more pictures. Okay, this is what's happening now. A lot of people are lifting their houses, but it doesn't look that good. I'm speaking as a photographer. It's really messed up our historic landscape. You know, we have some historic houses left, and then we have something way up high, and then a couple more historic houses and way up high. It's just disorienting to me personally. Maybe I'll get used to it. Not sure. Okay, and one more picture. Now that's our little Methodist church, also going way up. And we had just gotten a new minister like 10 days before the hurricane. And she had to crawl with her dog into the attic of her house because the floodwaters were coming in, and then she waited for a boat to get over, and she crawled out a window and got in a boat and went to a safe place. There are many harrowing stories of how people dealt with the rising water entering their homes and hearing their floorboards popping up. One older couple just got in their bed, and the water came into their house, and it was swirling around their bed until their son showed up in his boat and picked him up and took him to his house. So we had boats running just right down the main roads that we're usually driving cars, and plenty of coastal towns have that. So, in conclusion, I want to say, I feel like we have got to learn how to grieve, because grieving is totally in line with what has happened. And it really doesn't help when people come to visit and say, oh, everything looks great, you know, because they missed the months when the ferries didn't run and you couldn't enter or depart the island unless you had a license plate that, or driver's license that said Ocracoke. And, you know, it just doesn't help. It doesn't honor the experience that people have been through and are trying to integrate. And yes, some people's houses are way better than they ever used to be. They never would have gotten enough money to make the kitchen they now have. But again, it might have been better to go to the bank and get out a loan or save for 10 years or just keep the kitchen you've got because it's been working fine. You know, so it's a mixed jumble of some good changes and some very difficult changes. So I think learning how to grieve and for everybody to stop thinking that everything is supposed to last forever. Whoever said that? Who told us that? that if it's good now, we don't ever want it to change. It's going to stay just like this. And I know all the adults in the room know that is not true. That is so not true. And I don't know who we're trying to protect by not telling them. There are many challenges in life, and the coast, as great as it is, has become a very big challenge. Very big.
Wow.
I'm in the process trying to decide what I'm doing in the future, and I don't know. But I thank you for giving me a chance to speak today.
And I knew what you were going to talk about because you and I talked about it, and I am still caught off guard in a good way. My goodness, I don't even know the emotions I'm feeling right now. Elizabeth, you have any thoughts on what you just heard from Ann?
I mean, I just want to say first and foremost, thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience of your community with us, and also for taking those fabulous photographs and for documenting the things that you love and also the things that are changing. I think that you might not know what you're going to do, and that makes a lot of sense. And you'll be so glad I'm sure you already are so glad that you have those photos, but they're really important for so many people, and you're doing a great service by taking them. I also want to read your book, the 10,000s Breakfast book. So really, I just want to say thank you. And thank you, Dawn, for your fabulous idea, because that's it. Ann's story and our listening to it is what I hoped to do, and share with people in Making Rising. So, I don't really have much that I want to add to what she said. It's
hard to add to that, isn't it? Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. And let me be clear that that was a total steal on my part. David Crosby, fellow faculty member in first year seminar. He has been having Ann come to his class, and I was like, dude, how did I not know about this? So I totally got onto that. So let's segue back to our panelists then. Thank you again, Ann. That was just amazing.
Thank you.
And can we keep Ann as a person in this conversation? I don't know if we can have these questions be for both of us, because I think
absolutely,
and your voice is more important than my voice.
And absolutely, let's remind the audience that I do have a chat running. Important. Yeah. So if you got questions out there, let me know, okay? And I'll pass them on to whoever they're directed towards.
In talking about elevating people's voices and things like that, and also thank you so much, Ann, for sharing that amazing story. That was really, really. That was amazing to hear. Thank you. When writing about humans and their relationships with the more than human world, you invite people's vulnerabilities into the conversation. How does encouraging vulnerability and allowing space for emotions and feelings help us to respond to the climate crisis?
You talking to me?
To whomever would like to answer.
I want to say something, but I don't have to go first.
You go, Ann. You go.
Well, helping people feel their emotions is another part of my life's purpose. And I think it's so incredibly important. What are we hiding? Why are we hiding? Let's say the things that are important to us, that we love, or that make us mad. We've got to own up to who we are. And being in nature helps people get grounded. And that is such an amazing offering. So if we're living in the middle of nature, we're just living a more grounded life. We know how we feel. Whether people like it or not is another subject, but we're more connected with ourselves and how we feel. So.
And I want to add to that. People ask me all the time, like, oh, what should we do to combat the climate crisis? And one of the things I always say is, like get politically involved. All those things are important, but also go spend time outside, connect with the thing that you are working supposedly on behalf of. I think so many of us can get really divorced from that, and then we get kind of lost in the work that we're doing, right? So I think you're right. Just stepping outside and taking a walk, even in, your paved neighborhood or whatever, you're going to see things that you didn't know to expect or anticipate when you woke up in the morning. And those little delights can just fuel you and ground you and kind of shift your perspective for sure. It's one of the things that's been keeping me going through the pandemic. Every day I go for a run by the river near my house, and it's like a janky old kind of polluted river, but I still try to notice one special thing every single morning. Today, the water was so still. I was like, I haven't seen it this still in months. And it smelled funky because the tides are really high around here right now. And it was really, really low tide. So it exposed part of the ground that's usually underwater. It was awesome. And then you think, wow, I know that the tides are really extreme right now because I haven't seen that bit of land exposed.
Elizabeth, I think, I'm sorry. I think
equinox.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's been the equinox. The tides run higher and lower than normal. So you saw it.
Yeah.
I think
there's such a small step between loving something about nature and then political actions. That's the ticket.
Yeah.
Find something you love about nature and go see it all the time. And then it's just a small step to participate in the river cleanup or whatever.
Omia, I think
offshore drilling.
I think these two are leading right into your question, Omia, if I'm not mistaken. Why don't you throw that one out there for us?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So basically rising, and even your photography, and it's a chorus of voices used to tell stories. So since beginning your projects and your field of work, how have you observed the work around climate conservation? How have you seen it like grow and develop over time?
I mean, I think that when I started writing Rising, for instance, the term environmental justice was a word you could find in some fairly academic books to talk about the different ways in which different aspects of social justice, racial justice, class justice intersect with environmental vulnerability. And it was often talked about like in those kind of wonky ways. And really in like the last 5 years, I think that we have a lot more mainstream stories that talk about those overlapping vulnerabilities, but do so in a way that doesn't like just relegate it to the world of academic studies and, the jargon-filled conversations that folks in the ivory tower have that like no one else somehow gets privy to sometimes. So there's definitely been a really big shift, I think, in pulling that narrative into a more public space. And you see it now, like the newspaper will run stories about this as hurricanes come ashore. That wasn't true 10 years ago. It was really uncommon 10 years ago. So I feel like that's a really big shift that I've seen. And I imagine as a photographer, and I imagine living in a place that has a fair amount of tourism, there's got to be exhibitions around humans and nature on Ocracoke. I'm wondering if those have changed like visually in the time that you've been there.
Well, not yet, but part of why I made these images was to show people, hey, it also looked like this one day, for months.
Yeah, it's not just beautiful sunsets and wading birds, or
No.
I think that's so special that you both communicate in your own way, if that's through images or quite literal literature. And as a comm major and an SD minor, I'm learning about how important the language we use is when communicating about climate change. What skills or approaches do you find helpful when translating climate issues to make it more digestible for the average person to understand and remain engaged? And how do you approach communicating with an increasingly small majority of Americans who are still climate deniers?
Anne, do you want to answer that? I can answer that, but I'm curious from your perspective, if you have ways that you engage with folks who are maybe, how do you talk about climate change? Do you talk about it?
I talk about it, and I take people on a beach ride and I show them this area used to be sand when I moved here, and now it's a wetland. And look at these plants. These are Phragmites, and they are degrading the wetland. So I got the hands-on method going, and I think it's easier to remember things sometimes if there's an experience. If your head's out the window and the wind is blowing, it's a little more interesting. To me, it is. So tactile experience.
Yeah, and I think like building on that, I often ask people about their experience of how the environment has been changing. Like I might not start with, what do you think of climate change? I might say like, oh, you've lived in that place for 50 years. How has it changed since you've been there? And they can usually, if someone's been in place for long enough, they know that things are changing, whether it's, a guy who pulls lumber out of the woods in northern Maine, or someone who's lived on a barrier island for 50 years. Our world is fundamentally shifting. And I think building off of people's lived experience is a really great way to open the door to that conversation.
And to help them connect the dots. What beach have they always gone to for vacation? What's happening there? How does it look now? Help them realize what they're looking at, because they may not know.
Yeah, and thinking about that, connecting the dots, one thing I noticed when I ran a course in Maine where I had my students collect firsthand environmental change stories is that sometimes, we have a special thing. We had a special thing called short term, which is when you get your students full time for 1 month. I don't know if App State has anything like that, but it was a really special experience for me. And it meant that I got to take my students out to our coastal research center for 2 weeks, and we interviewed fisher folk and ice fishers and folks who worked in the timber industry about their experience of changing climates in Maine, the changes in the environment in Maine. And at the end of that month, we edited all the stories and we put them in an immersive online platform, and we held a launch party for the stories, for the storytelling website. And my students even made a bluegrass band during our 1 month semester. So they played at the launch. We brought everyone together. And some folks in that group were climate change deniers, or didn't want to talk about climate change. And yet they started to connect the dots, like what Anne was saying, when they heard about, oh, you have these warmer winters up north and you can't pull as much timber out of the forest because the ground isn't frozen. Oh,
yeah.
Your mom and pop ski hill that you've run for 35 years, third of the season this year, there wasn't enough snow. It was interesting to see when they got to have the conversation with other people who are living through similar kinds of changes, but in different work industries, that there was like an awareness of, oh, this is bigger than just me. This is bigger than just the lobster are going a little bit further offshore because the water's colder out there, cold enough for them to thrive. So I think that also helping folks connect the dots and making it not about like this scientific narrative, but firsthand stories of people really facing difficult circumstances. You hear those stories enough from sources that feel similar to you, less like a sort of power imbalance that you're being taught something, but you just listen. So I would say as a climate communicator, thinking about how do you have a conversation that's more horizontal? And that might mean you step out of it and you put someone else into it. Because we all get our hackles up if we feel like we're being, explained to.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, because that's kind of the approach I've been taking with my students. Is just what you said. Is I like your line there about kind of a horizontal approach, and that component of all of us have stories for sure. This is a great point to slide to our last point, because this is like a good class, right? A bad class is one where you're always watching the clock. This is not one of those. This is not one of those moments. But I think Laura's got some. Something to talk to us about that horizontalism, if you will. Laura?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your story and for the conversation between the two of you, Anne and Elizabeth, and the ways that students prompted it. I really appreciate it. And Anne, I love the point that you made about it being a really, small leap from paying attention and noticing the changes and then getting involved. And that's really what I want to note, is that we have a very active local climate action movement here in Boone. The students on this in this session know about it, and it really is featuring student leadership. The Appalachian Climate Action Collaborative, which has been active for about 4 years now. And I just would encourage any members of our audience, students, faculty, staff, community members who would like to get involved in climate action here locally in Boone to just do a Google search for the Appalachian Climate Action Collaborative, and you'll find ways to get involved.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, shoot, here we are, Elizabeth. It's gone by quickly, hasn't it, this past year? So I want to thank you, Elizabeth. You've just been just a wonderful guest, and just couldn't have gone any better. The only thing, if we have to indulge the negative side of things, is I've had more than one person say, "Man, we got to get her to campus," and I'm like, "Yeah, I think that's totally right." And you know what? Maybe we can do that. You just never know, right? It kind of jives with some of Anne's comments there. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to your agent, Christy Henricks. She is amazing. Thanks to Milkweed Editions, who published the book. They saved us. Just, there's no other way to put it. They saved us. Thank you, Laura, and your students. It's nice to meet you all. And thank you, David Crosby. Thank you for putting Anne on our collective maps. Also, thanks to the Watauga County Library and Monica Caruso. We're getting as many of these copies into people's hands as we can in the community. So I hope a lot of them were able to make it today. And if not, this will be recorded for them. Also, Monica got us connected to Foggy Pine Books. We gave them some books to give away to readers and community members. And our friends at Stick Boy Bread Company did the same. Thanks to my Common Reading committee members. They do a lot of reading over the summer, and I appreciate all that they do and my discussions and collaborations with them. Thanks to Dr. Mark Ginn in Academic Affairs, Dr. Ted Zaruka, General Education, Dr. Rick Klima in First Year Seminar, and everybody out there. I kind of lied. This isn't the end. We're going to have our inaugural Common Reading podcast here in a few weeks, and Elizabeth's going to be my very first guest. So stay tuned for that on social media outlets and the Common Reading website. And I'll see if I can come up. I got a lot to live up to, right? She's told us all year long that these have been the best questions she's ever been asked. So I have a lot to kind of live up to.
I mean, you stumped me on the quiz today, so
I was going to say, who knows? A segment of that might be Elizabeth's revenge, the quiz revenge. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, especially to our listeners out there. We hope you enjoyed this as much as we did. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. Be safe and be well.